Hello and welcome to another episode of Voices to End Hunger. I'm Minerva Delgado. The school year is in full swing across the country, and approximately 30 million school-aged children are lining up in cafeterias every day to eat a school-provided lunch. These meals are nutritious, offering a balance of fruits, vegetables, low-fat or fat-free milk, whole grains, and lean proteins. However, not all students have equal access to school meals or the interest in eating them. On this episode, I speak with Abbie Watts, Director of School Food Advocacy at Community Food Advocates, or CFA, in New York City. We'll discuss CFA's solutions to both issues of school meals access and appeal in New York, as well as the state's journey to universal school meals, New York City's innovative cafeteria redesign program, and what lessons the rest of the country can take away from New York's experience. Abbie, welcome to the podcast. It's wonderful to have you with us today, and thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
First of all, why don't you share a little bit for our listeners about Community Food Advocates, about how the organization works and its unique position in New York City and New York State?
Sure. So, Community Food Advocates, we're a policy advocacy organization, and our mission is to utilize high impact public policy that ensures all New Yorkers have access to healthy, affordable, culturally affirming foods within a sustainable and equity centered food system. So, that's a mouthful. But essentially, we work to shape food policies that will ensure our communities are served in the best possible way. And we do this through strategic coalition building and partnerships. For instance, when CFA started, we were founded by Kathy Goldman and Agnes Molnar, two incredible food policy heroes of mine. Our work was really centered around advocating for universal free school meals in New York City. And really, at that time, it was free school lunch because we had already had free school breakfast in the city. And that was with our Lunch for Learning coalition. So we really work with coalition partners and apply this strategy to our policy work. So the Lunch for Learning coalition is a coalition we still are together today, even after getting universal school meals in the city. We're a group of diverse partners, including young people, students from the city, parents, school-based unions, academics, and other aligned organizations and groups. And as we've grown, our areas have expanded beyond that school meals focus, while school meals continues to be one of the main areas, and that's my focus at CFA. We also work on good food purchasing, which is all about transforming the way public institutions like schools, but also hospitals, correctional facilities, and other public institutions use their enormous purchasing power to strengthen local and regional food systems. So we've recently also been launching into some work around supermarket access in New York City. But for both our school meals and good food purchasing program work, we work at both the city and state levels. We also have an incredible youth leadership program where young people from New York City public schools become school food experts in their own right and develop the skills and really engage in school food advocacy.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for the audience, I've been on the board of directors of Community Food Advocates since the beginning in 2010. And again, shout outs to the late Kathy Goldman, who founded the organization along with Agnes Molnar, and also to Liz Ackles, the current executive director. So it's a pleasure for me to have you on because I work so closely with CFA. Moving on to school meals in New York, tell us a little bit about just the landscape there. How many schools and school children are there in New York City and New York State? How have the meals traditionally been administered in the schools? And how does that differ from region to region? Like, so comparing New York City to maybe the Adirondacks, for example.
Sure. So New York City Public Schools is the largest school district in the country. There are nearly 1 million students in the public school system, and that's across about 1,800 schools. That number was actually slightly higher before the pandemic. There were over 1 million students before the pandemic, but there was some attrition in enrollment there. So New York City is, we're huge. And New York State is as well. So across the state, there's, I think it's 2.5 million students in public schools, and that's across about 4,000 schools. I think that number is closer to 5,000 when you include charter schools, and about 700 districts. So New York City is really one district, and then there's all these other districts across the state. So I said 2.5 million students in public schools. That number is actually a little more. 2.7 million students have access to school meals across the state. And that's because other parochial non-public schools can also offer school meals through their schools as part of the National School Breakfast and Lunch Program. And in terms of the state itself, we're really geographically diverse. A large portion of the student population is centered around downstate, so New York City, but also surrounding areas like Long Island and Westchester. But the rest of the state, there are other big cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and there's more rural areas that are really spread out, like you mentioned, the Adirondacks. So there's also a great amount of socioeconomic diversity across the state. But really, we do see a great need, and there's food insecurity in all of these areas. There's this great resource from Feeding America called Map the Meal Gap. They have this map so you can actually visually see color by county. And if you look at the food insecurity rates for children across New York, it's pretty consistently in like a 13 to 26% range, meaning that in most counties of the state, around 13 to 26% of children are considered food insecure. There are some lower rates in parts of the state, such as counties that would be considered the suburbs of New York City, where there's higher incomes, like Long Island and Westchester. But for the most part, that percentage really aligns with the statewide estimate of food insecurity of 1 in 5 children.
Thank you. Congratulations are in order. New York State is now the ninth state to offer free school meals for all public school students. And that's what we're calling universal school meals. So we're using those terms interchangeably. Tell us a little bit about the journey the state took to get to this point and how community food advocates played a role in that, partnerships, key turning points.
Yes, so thank you. We are, of course, thrilled with this achievement. Community Food Advocates partnered with Hunger Solutions New York to co lead the effort in New York, which we call the Healthy School Meals for All New York Kids Coalition. Another mouthful. But as you mentioned, Universal School Meals also works as a stand in. So, Hunger Solutions New York is a statewide anti hunger organization that does a lot of work around access to the federally funded nutrition assistance programs, including school meals. And CFA, with our work and our policy expertise on school meals and our history of achieving universal free school lunch in New York City through our strategic organizing and coalition building. So we were really poised together to partner to lead this effort. And it grew over the years. There are now 350 organizations or partners supporting this work and part of the coalition. To give you a little bit of the story, during the pandemic, there were these waivers put in place by the federal government that allowed schools across the country that participated in the national school breakfast and lunch programs at the time to provide free school meals to all their students. So basically removing some of those administrative barriers that are usually in place in some schools and allowing schools to just recognizing there was a need during the pandemic to make sure food was getting out to communities. They allowed schools to just provide those meals free for all. So those federal waivers ended in June of 2022. And for a second there, advocates were kind of hoping that seeing the impact of that interim policy shift would be noticed enough to solidify into like a national universal school meals program. Unfortunately, that didn't come to pass, but what it did spark were campaigns in states across the country. And as you mentioned, New York is now one of 9 states with a statewide universal free school meals policy. And our campaign actually started earlier in 2022 because we foresaw those ending of waivers in June. And we started campaigning for free school meals across the state. And even in that first year, we saw a really great win. We managed to get an expansion of free school meals. So there were schools that were able to start offering free school meals in the 2023-24 school year. And without getting too much in the weeds, there were some schools that kind of came on mid-year because of a policy change at the federal level. And then that expansion was sustained the following year, so last school year, which was 2024-25. And that last year was really the first full year of that expansion. So we're still waiting on some data just from last year to be able to more fully look at the impact of that. But we do know around 384,000 students gained access to free school meals. And that's about 1,400 schools that newly started offering free school meals for all. So a really huge impact even then. But of course, the full, truly universal free school meals went into effect this school year. So earlier this year, at the start of the budget season, Governor Hochul announced that universal school meals would be included in her executive budget. And that really set the stage for getting it through the legislature and in the final budget. So we are now amidst universal free school meals, and it's a reality here in New York, which is super exciting.
It's wonderful. And another shout out to Governor Hochul for her visionary leadership on this and making sure it's something that New York State families can really benefit from. So, Abby, can you explain how free school meals work and how they benefit children, families, and schools, and even the state overall?
So I see school meals as kind of the perfect opportunity for a whole institution to ensure that an entire portion of the population, which in this case is school-age children, have access to at least 2 meals a day. School buildings have this infrastructure. Most school buildings have a kitchen and cafeteria, and they have the people power to serve millions of children. So that's around 30 million children served each day across the country. And there's a bunch of evidence out there to show the positive impacts of providing school meals, and specifically providing universal free school meals have been found to reduce hunger, improve academic outcomes. There's physical and mental health impacts, and it makes it more affordable for families. And one of the one of Governor Hochul's key talking points, which I'll tout came from our work and our messaging, is that it saves families $165 a month in groceries per child. And there's the added burden of families not having to go out and get those specific groceries. I think of the mental load of parents of having to make meals and plan those meals every day. Maybe those effects are less studied, but I think it has a lot of ripple effects on in terms of impacts.
And how has it reduced the administrative burden for the schools themselves?
Sure. So in the traditional structure, a family would usually have to fill out a form to show that they are income eligible. And then the schools have to process those forms and identify whether a student is or isn't eligible, or if they're free, reduced, or paid. And that's a big burden on the school administrations to be able to process all of those forms, and pressure on the families to submit them. There can be language barriers to the forms, and just making sure that they're getting processed accurately even. We know that families fall between the cracks just in terms of how those forms might be filled out. So the way that the traditional structure of school meals is set up, there's kind of a lot of places that families can fall between the cracks, and families might be faced with having to pay a full price for a meal when they are in fact eligible.
And I know, to me, when I think about free school meals, one of the benefits I believe to the students is just removing the stigma of who gets a free
Mhm.
meal versus who pays. And I know a big part of the campaign for community food advocates was working with students themselves to talk about this and raise up their concerns around the stigma. Do you want to talk a little bit about that aspect?
Sure. Yeah. I'm actually thinking of our Youth Food Advocates program. My colleague Anna Lilia Ariza leads that youth leadership work. And that includes, I think there's about 20 students from across the 5 boroughs in this year. And she was reflecting that the cohort that is starting in Youth Food Advocates this fall, they were in first and second grade when New York City Public Schools began offering free school meals. And what she's hearing from them and what they're reflecting from what their peers are saying too is that they're not experiencing that poverty stigma, or kids being bullied in the cafeteria. That stigma associated with school food really seems to be, I mean, caveat, this is anecdotal. I would love to see more research in the area of stigma and how universal school meals can reduce that stigma. But from what we've seen, there really is a lasting impact from this group of students.
Thank you. I think one of the bigger pushbacks on this particular policy for states that have not implemented it is that the children of wealthier families are benefiting from something that they don't need and using taxpayer funding for that. Could you address this argument as well?
So this is a common misperception that families and schools that aren't eligible for free school meals are affluent, and that the state doesn't need to invest there because those families that can afford it. We know the reality is that hunger exists in every community. We looked at areas of Long Island. So as we were doing this campaign and we saw the expansion and we are identifying parts of the state where schools and kids were being left out of the expansion, and you might look at these pockets and say, oh, well, that's Long Island. That's like a quote unquote affluent or wealthier area. But you look at the cost of living in those areas. So there's this great set of data from United Way. It's called ALICE data. It's asset limited, income constrained, and employed. It's a great data set that really looks at what things truly cost in any area. So we look at an area of Long Island, and the the cost of living to cover basic expenses is $90,000. So for a family of four. So that same family of four that just to cover basic needs needs $90,000 and to qualify for school meals is $56,000. That actually is a family that could use that support, and access to school meals would be greatly influential. So there's a lot of nuance there that I think isn't always captured when we talk about blanket, like universal school meals and, making that accessible to all. There really is a need in every community.
New York City's had free school lunch since 2017. Can you point to the positive impacts of this policy and how might that help universal school meal advocates across the country?
Yeah, so I joined Community Food Advocates in the fall of 2018. I just realized I just had my 7-year anniversary.
Congratulations.
um, so this was about 1 year after school meals started being free for all in New York City. So I've had the privilege of seeing what's possible once that foundational access piece is in place. And what we've seen in New York City is some really great initiatives blossom that I don't know if would have been possible without that foundational piece of universal free school meals. There's a cafeteria enhancement initiative. There were a lot of halal and kosher meals, a lot of menu developments and innovations that have taken place over the past several years that in part are because of some great leadership within the New York City Public Schools School Food Department, but also I think it really speaks to what can happen when school meals are free for all students.
And I do remember there was a study, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was put out by Columbia University that looked at the positive impacts of this policy and identified that children were eating more of the meals, which we know are extremely nutritious, that their academic performance improved, that discipline problems decreased. Were there other results of that study that we should mention?
Studies have shown that when school meals, and specifically when school meals are made free for all, that that works towards combating food insecurity. There's increases in participation, and I don't know if the stigma piece is as well studied, but there is that reduction in stigma. The application barrier for families is removed and the administration barrier. And students have, impact on academic performance and their health and well-being overall.
For states that don't offer universal school meals, how can they use the community eligibility provision, which is a federal policy, to help more children? And maybe we can start out by just explaining what that is to our listeners.
Sure. So the community eligibility provision, which we often refer to as CEP for short, this is something that came out of the 2010 Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. So they kind of phased it in following that. But essentially, it allows a school, a group of schools, or an entire district to be able to serve free school meals to all of their students without collecting applications for up to 4 years at a time. If there's a high enough percentage of low-income students, then that school or its group of schools or entire district can then be eligible for CEP and offer those free school meals to all their students without the barrier of an application. I will just asterisk this, that schools still want families to submit those income applications. That income information is still important to schools to be able to qualify for other types of funding and supports. So that still exists, but it's not for the sole purpose of identifying whether a family is eligible for those school meals.
Thank you. Just turning to what's happening now and recently in federal policy, the recent passage of the administration's landmark One Big Beautiful Bill Act will have a huge impact on food assistance programs and food security efforts. Can you talk a little bit about some of these concerns, especially cuts to SNAP, and how that could impact student certification for free school meals? And potentially limit schools' ability to implement CEP as well.
So, as this audience probably knows, SNAP is one of the main ways that schools determine if students qualify for free or reduced price meals. That direct certification as part of CEP, SNAP is one of those means tested programs that determines if a school, group of schools, or district can adopt CEP. So if families lose access to SNAP or their benefits are reduced, it could also result in fewer students qualifying for free meals or being classified as low income. For I'm just thinking of New York, throughout the campaign in New York, we heard about schools that were eligible for CEP by just a handful of students. So I think of those schools when I think of even small changes to eligibility here, because that's devastating for individual families, but it can have ripple effects for the school's CEP eligibility or the structure and school food funding that school's getting.
Thank you for that. So let's turn to student satisfaction with the meals, right? So we can make school meals free, but that doesn't automatically change how students may feel about school meals. And just thinking back to my school meal experience, I don't know that I would have opted to have the meals if I had other options. So I know Community Food Advocates has been working beyond the changes to access to make sure that the meals are appealing to students, that students have a say in how they feel about school meals. So we'd just love to hear more about your work in this area.
One of the beautiful things about our coalition and partnership work is that those directly impacted by the policies we're advocating for are part of shaping that policy. So throughout our campaign for universal school meals in the city, we were gathering insights about the major factors impacting school meal participation and the general culture and attitudes around school meals in the city. And the things that really bubbled up were around improving the cafeteria environment and food appeal. So it just so happened around that time, the Office of Food and Nutrition Services, which is the office in New York City public schools that administers school meals, they were piloting something called the Cafeteria Enhancement Experience, which we at CFA also refer to as cafeteria redesign. So this is an initiative that really modernizes both the service line and the seating area of the cafeteria to make it a more welcoming space for students and really enhances the food appeal. That's done by a serving line setup that's more of a grab and go style than the traditional service line. And that's great not only for the autonomy of students to be able to select their meals as they go through the line, it also really speeds up service. And when you're talking about serving hundreds or even thousands of kids in a matter of hours and giving them sufficient time to eat, that saved time in the service line is super important. So School Food or Office of Food and Nutrition Services was rolling out this pilot, and we were looking at the impact and seeing an increase in participation and the positive reception from students in the school community. And having heard all this during our campaign and from partners about the importance of these, the cafeteria environment and food appeal, we shifted our focus to advocating for funding for cafeteria redesign. So since 2018, we've been the Lunch for Learning Coalition, that coalition that led the advocacy for free school lunch in New York City. That coalition has been advocating for the city to fully fund this expansion to all middle and high schools. And just last year, so 2024, we secured in the 5-year capital plan the remaining funding. So over the past several years, we've had kind of incremental investments in the capital funding. So this is city funding that goes to the Office of Food and Nutrition Services and the school construction authority to be able to put these in place. It is a structural capital project, but very cost effective. And when we're talking about 500 schools, that $275 million investment that we secured has been dedicated to fully expanding the initiative to all middle and high schools.
I remember you hosted a walkthrough of a school in Brooklyn that had been through this redesign. And I was amazed to learn that students left on a Friday and came back on Monday, and the cafeteria looked different, had been painted. And I remember walking in and thinking, wow, this doesn't look like a school cafeteria. It looks like a food court. I thought it was so impressive. And the students just seemed to really love it. I was impressed at how quickly the line moved, but mostly that the students seemed to really be enjoying the meals. They talked about in glowing terms about the changes, but also about how good the meals were. And what shocked me, and I didn't say it, tell them, but I was like, it's the same food. And so, presentation matters, right? I think that's so important, and didn't feel like this industrial kitchen. I remember it was a menu, kids would go through and grab what they wanted to eat. So I would imagine it also reduces waste, food waste.
I think of the expression "we eat with our eyes." Because I think the cafeteria redesign real and as you said, Minerva, it is the same food, you know? It's there might be more variety on a daily basis, which I think also contributes to reduction in food waste and students being able to select what they want to eat that day. But being able to see the food displayed in a fresh way and just walking into the service line, it really is kind of you eat with your eyes first experience.
Yeah, it was wonderful to see so many students really enjoying the meals and enjoying each other. So I walked away feeling so excited about the cafeteria enhancement experience. And when I speak to school food advocates from across the country who say, we're just concerned that students are not finding the meals appealing. I always point to what you guys are doing in New York, because if New York City can do it, then I feel like the other states should be able to take this on, because if you can manage this with the logistics of such a big school system, that these are things that can be replicated throughout the country. So it's just great to know that there's a way to increase access to school meals, but also to increase the appeal and have students be engaged in the way you all are engaging students. And I understand they speak to school food administrators on a regular basis and give their recommendations. And so that's wonderful to hear as well.
Yes, our youth food advocate interns are really incredible. I think it's easy when you ask a student one of the most common things if you ask a student about school meals you might hear is, "Oh, the food sucks." Like, but like what that may be true, but and it may not be because maybe they haven't tasted school meals in the past 5 years, and school meals have changed a lot over time. But I think the way that the youth food advocate interns learn about and are critically thinking about school meals and learning about the nuances of the operations and policy, if they have critiques, they have solutions too, and they have ideas, and they bring these amazing ideas to, as you mentioned, Minerva, the school administration is all ears, you know? They are really open to hearing what the students want to see change, and, I think the youth food advocates are really incredible partners in this work.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see the students themselves really be invested in school meals and kind of take ownership in a way that they feel empowered to make recommendations and to work with the school meal leadership. So that's wonderful. So, as we close out, what are some main points you'd like to really stick with advocates who are fighting for universal school meals in their own cities and states?
It's it's tough to answer because every state is so unique. And I think the timing and conditions under which the advocacy is happening, whether that's the political environment or competing priorities, or level of funding of a campaign. And I do think there's some aspect of the stars aligning, and on that front in terms of like what the conditions environment is. But I guess what I'll say is I think probably more general to what I've experienced with advocacy over time. So often it's a long game that takes a lot of perseverance and strategy. The relationship building aspect is, I think, a really special and central component, whether with coalition partner organizations, elected officials, students, parents, and other members of the school communities. But I think, we as advocates have some expertise. We have a certain expertise and a toolbox to be able to navigate the advocacy. But I think so much of the wisdom and the voices that should be elevated are really in those partnerships. I guess the last thing I'll just say is that it's important to celebrate the small and incremental wins because it's a long game. It can take a while to see some of those big wins, but there are shifts along the way that are really worth celebrating. And I think we all need to remember to do that.
Wonderful. I know they say it takes a village to raise a child. I think it also takes a village to feed a child, particularly when we're talking
Right.
about school food, those partnerships, starting with the students themselves and the parents and the Department of Education leadership, as well as all of the nonprofits, unions, school meal workers. It's so important to get everyone at the table.
Absolutely.
Abbie, thank you for joining us today. This has been very inspirational as well as educational. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Abbie Watts of Community Food Advocates in New York City. You can learn more about CFA, the Cafeteria Redesign Program, and more through our show notes. You can also submit questions or comments to us at podcast@alliancetoendhunger.org. This has been another episode of Voices to End Hunger. It was edited and produced by Nate McGrath. I'm Minerva Delgado. See you next time.